You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 490 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Joining me on today's show is Will Porter. He is a staff writer at RT with bylines at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and also at the libertarianinstitute.org, where me and Will have an archive co-authoring some articles. And, of course, you can find the 50-plus articles that are episodes that Will has been on this show in the podcast archive there. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. How you doing, Kyle?
Pretty good. And, just to say that it's really cool to, have you on this regular slot on the Mondays now as we approach episode 500. I think, obviously you're the most frequent guest on the show, and I really think we have a good one, even by standards of episodes that we've put out today, covering some very important topics. The first one being this thing going on in Venezuela, which was a coup attempt by the U.S., question mark, was the U.S. even involved? I guess we should just start with, tell us the story of what happened here. They say 50 people thought they were going to overthrow the Maduro regime. It just sounds absurd. So I'll let you tell the whole story so we could get it.
Yeah, sure. So this is a pretty long, detailed story here. So, feel free to cut me off whenever you need to, if you need clarification or anything. But this whole thing was basically unfolding like exactly when we were recording our last show, which I guess by the time this runs will be like 2 Sundays ago. And as you said, there was this failed raid or coup attempt on Venezuela by a group of 50 or 60 mercenaries that are linked to the political opposition there. And they launched this operation from Colombia on speedboats, apparently looking to like either kill or capture Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. He leads the socialist government there. And in this raid, the Venezuelan military and National Guard like stopped these speedboats pretty easily. Like their mission was crushed pretty much before it even started. So there wasn't even a whole lot of like action in terms of the raid itself. It kind of fizzled very quickly. It's not really clear what they expected to accomplish with 60 people in the first place. But the military ended up killing 8 of these guys and capturing another 13 within a day of the initial raid. And they seized a bunch of weapons, light arms and stuff. I don't think they had like really, really heavy weapons. And then since then, I think they've arrested another 10 people that they say were involved in this plot. And they're still looking for more. And so I think now they've arrested like 23 or 24 people that they say were related to this. I'm not 100% sure of the fate of the other, because I think the team was said to be 60 people in total, or 62 people. And so I'm not totally sure what happened to the other guys. They might have escaped, because I think after the initial raid took place on a Sunday, I think there was like a period of like a day there where they were still hunting down some of the other guys. And so some of them may have escaped. And so that's the remainder of them might still be out there. But as things started coming out after Maduro had initially announced this attempted raid, things have sort of like trickled out since then. But the story has gotten a lot more interesting since it was initially announced. And so it turns out that 2 Americans were actually on this mission. These guys named Aaron Berry and Lucas Denman. And they worked for this private security firm based in Florida called Silvercorp USA, like a private, a security contractor firm, like a smaller version of Blackwater or something. And both of these guys were captured. Both of the Americans were actually arrested by the Venezuelan authorities. And they've now been charged with terrorism and conspiracy. And so I guess they're going to be facing trial there in Venezuela. And parts of Lucas Denman, one of these Americans, part of his interrogation was actually broadcast on Venezuelan state TV, where you can see him. You can go and YouTube it or whatever. You can see him saying that, saying they plan to seize an airport in Caracas, in the capital city. And they plan to capture Maduro and bring him back to the United States, where right now he's wanted on, narco terrorism charges, as we've covered before on the show. He's been indicted here. Now, of course, this guy's confession could have been coerced, and, that certainly happens. And Maduro has certainly blamed things on the U.S. government before without providing evidence. But Denman, this American in his interrogation, and Maduro and the Venezuelan government, they're not the only ones telling the story. Like, it's not just on their say so alone. There's a lot of other corroboration. And so the CEO and the founder of this private security firm involved, Silvercorp, is this guy named Jordan Goudreau. And he's a Canadian American, and he's a former Green Beret. He's a military veteran for the U.S. military, and he plays a major role in this whole plot here. And so just a few days before the failed raid on May 3rd, so the raid was on a Sunday, and on the Friday before, the Associated Press ran this story talking about this far-fetched plot by the Venezuelan opposition to use a small group of fighters to, take over military bases and incite a popular revolt. And in this Associated Press story, they mention this Jordan Goudreau guy and his company, Silvercorp USA, who we now know, these two Americans who were captured in this raid, we know they worked for. And so this AP story is saying that, this American security firm is involved in this plot to incite a revolt, and that this Goudreau guy had met this other Venezuelan defector named Cliver Alcala, who's a retired general in Venezuela. He used to be very close to the Maduro government, but he's since defected. And he went to Colombia to start this exile camp for other defected soldiers. And as you'll remember, this raid was launched from Colombia, and so a lot of this whole thing was planned in Colombia, it seems. And so, according to this AP story, Goudreau, the American CEO of the security firm, he met this Venezuelan defector through Donald Trump's personal bodyguard, actually, Keith Schiller. And this Schiller guy apparently brought Goudreau along with a few meetings to the Venezuelan opposition, because the U.S. government is consistently meeting with them. But at some point, the Trump bodyguard Schiller, he decided that Goudreau is not really trustworthy. He's not really reliable. The guy's kind of like an S-talker, a BSer. And so he cut off contact with him. Apparently, this is the story that the AP is telling, at least. But by that point, though, the American had already made his own connections with the Venezuelan opposition, mostly through this Alcala guy. And so that sort of is the story that the AP is laying out here, is that this is how this American security firm got in touch with the Venezuelan opposition, was through somebody connected to the Trump administration.
So I just have a quick question.
Sure.
I guess two things related to the indictment of Maduro. I thought I remembered Alcala being somebody who was indicted, but I could be wrong about that, or it may not even be relevant to this story. And then do you have any idea if whoever captured Maduro, whether it be Silvercorp or some part of the Venezuelan opposition, if they would be able to claim that $15 million bounty that the U.S. put out as a part of that indictment on Maduro?
Okay, yeah. First of all, you are correct. Cliver Alcala was indicted alongside Maduro. Maduro and several other senior officials were indicted by the U.S. for this narco-terrorism stuff. And Cliver Alcala was indicted. And the story with him is like the U.S. government claimed that he had, because like I said, he previously was tight with the Maduro government. And so what they're claiming is that during that period when he was still working under under Caracas, under the official Venezuelan government, that he had worked in, to traffic drugs with FARC, the Colombian guerrilla group. And yes, Cliver Alcala did eventually turn himself in. I have the exact date on my timeline. I don't have it right off the top of my head, off the tip of my fingers. But it was sometime after Alcala apparently met this Goudreau guy. And so, Goudreau met Alcala through this Trump bodyguard. And then sometime a little bit later, like after he was indicted, he turned himself in. And so you are correct. He is one of the people who were indicted there. And then also. And so
just real quick. So just if he was indicted and at one point he did have contact with Silvercorp, is there any idea if he had contact with Silvercorp after he was indicted, or if maybe, any kind of Venezuelan opposition that like Alcala was, developing or grooming in Colombia, if they continue to work with Silvercorp, would that maybe put them in potential trouble with like the U.S. law, as this is an indicted felon of narco terror trafficking, whatever they want to call it. And I don't know, that seems like it would be a crime to me if I did it. So right. I don't know, I'm not sure if you know any of those details.
The idea that I get is that Alcala and Goudreau were working together prior to his indictment. So I think like this came a little later. This indictment was a newer thing. Like I think that they had been working on this plot all like throughout the last year, and the indictment came more recently. That was within the last couple months. And so I'm not totally sure how much the indictment like ties into this whole plot and whether that would implicate Silvercorp, in whatever crimes that Alcala was, accused of or whatever. I'm not totally sure. But your second question in terms of the, could Silvercorp or whoever carried out this mission to capture Maduro, could they get that bounty? And I guess so. I actually hadn't really considered that, whether that might have been one of their motivations to get this $15 million bounty from the State Department. Now, I know they had said something, I forget exactly what their wording was for what they offered it for. I thought it was just information that helped to get his arrest or helped to lead to his arrest. But I guess his actual arrest would be, even better. So maybe they would have paid up the bounty that they put out for that.
All right. Thanks for answering that. And you could get back on with, the story here.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So yeah, as I was saying, I was describing how Goudreau had been introduced to the Venezuelan opposition through Trump's bodyguard. Trump's bodyguard decided, no, this guy's not trustworthy, but he had already sort of made his, he had already sort of like weeded his way into the opposition. So they kind of cut out the Trump's bodyguard guy, according to the Associated Press. But this AP story, which is pretty important, I think, it does sort of like, it kind of gave us a preview of this whole operation before it happened, 2 days before they tried it. But the thing about the AP report is that it made it sound like this had already fallen apart, that this was already something they had given up on and that it was not happening. And it was sort of like, isn't this weird kind of story? Like, look at this far-fetched plot with the opposition. They were trying to do this crazy, crazy mission. But apparently the Associated Press was proven wrong because just a few days later, we see these guys actually trying this. And so on May 3rd, we have Goudreau, the CEO of this American security firm. He appears in this video that was shared on Twitter, and he's standing there with another Venezuelan military defector, and he's announcing the mission. He's saying that this daring amphibious raid had been launched from Colombia to liberate Venezuela. And this is like the first sign that they were actually doing this, and this is the same plot that was talked about in the AP story. It's the same American, it's the same, opposition figures, except now they're actually doing it. It's not something that was just like some kind of fantasy of theirs. But after his employees are captured and after his whole mission is a spectacular failure and people get killed and all this stuff, and it just totally doesn't work out. Goudreau starts talking to U.S. media outlets, and the story starts getting very interesting. He starts claiming that he had signed a contract for over $200 million with the opposition leader, Juan Guaido. And we've talked about him on the show a lot before. He's the guy who he declared himself interim president in 2019, and the U.S. backs him pretty strongly. The Trump administration has backed Guaido. And so apparently, according to Goudreau, the American, he signed a $200 million contract with the opposition to see this all happen, to make this all go through this mission. And Guaido, of course, denies having any part in this. And he says this has all been fabricated by Maduro as an excuse to persecute the opposition. And he says it's all just it was created to basically to damn the opposition. However, the Washington Post has actually gotten a copy of this 41-page contract. And the WAPO says that the opposition itself gave it to them. They didn't get it from some Maduro operative or something. They say they got it from opposition officials on the condition that they redact one page. And so it seems like it's authentic, this document, and it seems to be corroborating a lot of what this Goudreau guy has been saying. And the document clearly lists Guaido as the commander-in-chief of the operation. So it's kind of, at odds. It kind of cuts against his claim of having no involvement. Because Guaido has just denied it outright, flatly denied it. But it seems like, it's pretty clear he's listed in this document as being the commander of it, or of the highest official on this thing. And then also, too, we have this top advisor to Guaido, Juan Rendon, who's another well-known opposition guy. His signature is on the contract. Guaido's isn't, but again, there's one redacted page, so we don't really know what's on that page. But Juan Rendon has also confirmed to Reuters that he negotiated this deal with Goudreau, with this American security firm. And so I think that's further evidence that this is not just something that was made up and fabricated by Maduro. It seems very clear there was definitely a deal between the Venezuelan opposition and Silvercorp. There's a lot of evidence now, not only people say so, but also this contract. And there's also a smaller, 7-page services agreement that's not as long, it's not as detailed as the longer contract, but Guaido's name does appear on that. Guaido and Goudreau both signed that one. And so there's a lot of evidence here that there was some kind of deal between this American security firm and the Venezuelan opposition.
I just real quick, one of the things on the timeline, I just want to get some clarity on. The AP leaked the story about this plan before they actually went through with the raid.
Yes.
Okay, so that is stunning that you would have this mission with so few people involved, right? You're under 100, so you assume that just any military tactics at all suggests that you have to do something kind of covert. The U.S. could telegraph that, hey, we're coming on May 10th, and the Venezuelans couldn't do a damn thing to stop it, right? But if you're 50 people and you're just going to kidnap Maduro and they know you're coming on a certain date, that seems like a huge tactical disadvantage. And so I guess if you're just reading this story, I think the like simplest explanation here is that Maduro hired these people to come in and do this as a PR stunt. But you're saying that U.S. media, like the Washington Post and Reuters and all these organizations and outlets that me and from their typical coverage are not any kind of socialists, sympathize with Maduro for that, or any fans of Maduro whatsoever. In fact, their typical bent is, supporting the U.S. hawkish policy there. And you're saying that they're actually releasing documents and evidence, not from the Venezuelan government, but documents and evidence in part from, the mercenary group involved here, that's saying that, yeah, we were working with the Venezuelan opposition to try this raid against Maduro.
Yeah, exactly. Like they had it all right there in the AP story, just like 2 days before they tried this raid. And the thing is, too, the AP story actually kind of got it wrong. They said that they had planned to do it with 300 guys. And so it ended up being even fewer than that. And of course, like I said, the AP story was convinced that like this whole thing was like they had given up on it and that it was just like it was only a plan that they never went through with. But then a couple days later, surprise, like this. It's very clearly the same plan. It's all the same people involved. It's the same American security company. Like it has to be at least some version of that same plan. And so,
just because I think this source may be somewhat telling, do we have any idea who made that leak to the AP or how the AP found out? Just because it seems like whoever made that leak was trying to prevent this from happening.
Well, they had a bunch of different sources on that story, actually. They talked to different former associates of Goudreau. They talked to several unnamed opposition figures and people who were like, who I think knew Cliver Alcala. They have a bunch of different sources in that. I think a lot of them are unnamed, and so we don't really know exactly who. And we don't get a very good idea, too, of like what their motivations might have been. Because, again, if a lot of these people were convinced that this thing wasn't happening, they might not have thought that they were exposing something. So, they might have thought that that this is just, I don't know, it would have been moot at that point is what I'm saying. Like, they wouldn't have been exposing anything if they were convinced it wasn't going to happen. And so, anyway, even before that, and I should mention too, this is one thing that I don't think I've said yet. Goudreau, the American security CEO guy, he claims that the opposition actually went back on the deal and never paid him. And so we have all this contract, we have them signing the deal and stuff, but he claims that they never actually paid up. It was a huge sum of money that he was trying to get them to pay. And you can see in the contract, there's all these crazy provisions built in where like, even if they don't do anything, even if they don't do the deal, there's like several $1 million in retainer fees they were supposed to pay. And Goudreau claims they never paid any of it. They just like at one point cut contact with him and stopped, dealing with them. And so this is where it gets kind of weird because it's strange that he claims they never paid, but yet he went through with this mission anyway. And, maybe that's actually why it had fewer people than they expected because, some plans had changed at the last minute or something. But I can get into more of that later of like why I think they might have done it if that was the case. But even before that AP story ran, like it's interesting that we even had that 2 days preview. But there were actually way earlier indications that this was going to happen or something was going to happen with some kind of coup plot. Way back in late March, actually, we have stories of the Colombian police seizing this big cache of weapons, of like assault rifles and stuff. And within a few days of that, Cliver Alcala, this opposition figure, comes out and actually claims ownership of those weapons. And this is also before he was indicted and before he turned himself in. So this is while he's still a free man. He comes out on Twitter and then later in a radio interview, and he says that like these weapons belong to the Venezuelan people, and he said it's meant for this mission to liberate Venezuela. And he even kind of mentioned, like he kind of glancingly mentioned this contract with Guaido. He didn't mention like who it was signed with on the other end, but it was pretty clear he was talking about this very same plot with Silvercorp when these weapons were found and when he announced that this is part of his plan, part of his plot. So there were clear signs this was going to happen like months ago, all the way back in March. Yeah. So based on how quickly, Maduro crushed this operation, because they ended this thing before it really even got off the ground at all. I think it's pretty clear they must have been aware of this for quite some time. This high-ranking Venezuelan official and military commander, Diosdado Cabello, he actually said that they had infiltrated this plot so deeply that they were literally footing the bill for the meetings to set it up. Like they were paying for the venues for these, opposition guys to meet. And so I think it's pretty clear that they were tipped off about this plan quite a while ago. I think they were fully aware of what was going to happen, just based on how quickly they stopped it. Now, moving on to the question of U.S. government involvement, because that's a big question mark here. We're not totally, we haven't really gotten to that yet. I actually haven't personally seen any extremely solid evidence for that yet, that the State Department or the military was directly involved in this. But I would say it would definitely fit with the pattern of the Trump administration's policies on Venezuela, which, the entire time has been very hostile. We've imposed sanctions. We've vocally supported the opposition. We endorsed Guaido's claim to the presidency. And we even backed him when he tried to launch that, uprising in April of 2019. He tried to get the military and the security forces to do an uprising, and they wouldn't. And we were kind of, we backed that, at least rhetorically. Then, of course, in March, we indicted Maduro and a handful of other officials for this narco-terrorism stuff. And then a week later, we launched this counter-narcotics mission in the Caribbean, which we've talked about a few times, with the Navy. And we singled out Maduro by name when we launched that. And then also right around the same time, the State Department put out this new transitional framework for how we should replace Maduro and, push him out of power. And so it seems like, with all of this stuff happening just all in the same, the period of a couple of weeks or months, it seems like there was something going on behind the scenes there. They were gearing up for something. And another weird thing, just a few days after this raid, a day or two actually, after this failed mercenary raid, the U.S. appointed this new ambassador to Venezuela, James Story. And we haven't had a formal envoy to Caracas in 10 years. And we don't even have an embassy there anymore. I think we actually formally cut that off more recently. And so it's kind of weird that they would suddenly appoint this new guy, right after this failed raid. And then, of course, where is this guy based? Where does he work from? He works at the U.S. Embassy in Colombia, where this whole plot was apparently hatched, and where the same James Story guy has been working for several years in different roles. And so I don't know. I just find there's some weird timing for some of these decisions and some of these moves that I think these things are related, and they might be related to this failed raid. And we also have reason to believe, like I'm saying from that AP story, that this Goudreau guy was introduced to the opposition in the first place by an associate of Trump. Even though Goudreau claims that he had no backing from the U.S. government, he says he tried to get it, but they wouldn't, that he just couldn't get it. But who knows? Maybe he's just trying to cover somebody there. So ultimately, I think there's a few plausible scenarios of what could have happened here based on the evidence that I've seen. So I think if this Goudreau guy is telling the truth about getting no support from the U.S. government, which he very well may not be, then I think it's possible that this was just a totally reckless mission that was carried out by somebody who was way overconfident in his own abilities. And, he got in over his head, basically. And, all of his dealings with the opposition fell through. He couldn't get Trump to back him. And so this Goudreau guy just decided to go for broke anyway. And the reason I think that's possible is because if you read what his friends and colleagues say about him, the AP interviewed a few of them, a few other news outlets have interviewed some of his old military colleagues. They say that this guy has always been kind of naive. He's always chasing after some big break. And he might have even had some kind of delusions of grandeur, seeing himself as this great freedom fighter and this noble warrior and all this stuff. And so I think it's at least possible, it's at least plausible that he may have actually tried to do this mission on his own, even without getting, the contract, even without getting the money from the opposition, and even without getting support from the U.S. I think that's in the realm of possibility that this guy is just kind of a kook and that he set out on his own to do this. However, on the other hand, I also think it's very possible that this was another Bay of Pigs, the failed invasion of Cuba in 1961 by U.S.-backed defectors. This could have just been a repeat of what we did in Panama in the 1980s, where we tried to capture Manuel Noriega after we indicted him on drug charges, just like we have Maduro. So there's absolutely precedent for this kind of thing in U.S. foreign policy. And even though this was a disastrous failure, it very well still could have been backed by the U.S. government. The U.S. government, it's not like they've not backed failures before. And so Goudreau could be totally lying when he says he got no support from Washington. He could be lying when he says the opposition never paid him. Maybe all this stuff did happen, but the mission was just so badly managed, and the Venezuelans were so tipped off to it that now they're just trying to cover their behinds and trying to maintain some kind of plausible deniability. So maybe that's why the Goudreau is sort of insisting that he got no help with this. But either way, new things keep coming out about this. Like every day, there's some new stuff that's been trickling out about this story. It's all kind of ongoing. So we very well could see some evidence that the U.S. had a hand in this at some point. This is not like over by any means. We might get evidence that they were involved or that they at least knew about it. Because right now the U.S. government and Trump and stuff are saying they had no clue about this. They didn't even know it was happening. Maduro himself claims that they have proof. And so I'm curious. He's often claimed things like that before and not really delivered on it. So I'm just curious. I guess we just have to kind of wait to see what comes out next to see if, we do get indication or proof that Washington was behind this.
Right. Yeah. I think you make a good point there. Looking at this this puzzle here, we clearly have some missing pieces still. And, you've given us such a detailed picture. It's kind of easy to see what those missing pieces may look like. But you really don't know what they are until some more evidence surfaces. And, one thing that I think's worth noting is that even if the U.S. government didn't say, authorize this and, Trump didn't promise, air support when they landed, or, because obviously, they thought something was going to happen that didn't happen. There was no way that, these people thought that they were actually going to go in, unless you said that the delusions of grandeur of, the leadership there just, rally these fools into battle or something like that. But the U.S. government knowing about this and letting it happen seems somewhat problematic, landing an invasion on the shores of another country plotted in the United States of America. I don't think it's necessarily an intervention to put an end to that and, maybe to arrest the leader there. I did see that Venezuela is asking for the extradition of, I believe, just the head of Silver Corp, but maybe some other people within that organization. I can't imagine that the U.S. is going to extradite anybody to Venezuela. But it does seem like, if you believe in international law and sovereignty, that would kind of be the move. So, let's look forward here. You could come back on the show next week, next Monday, and we could talk about it again as far as what's actually happened. But as far as what's going to happen in the next week, I saw Secretary of State Pompeo saying that, the U.S. would secure the release of any Americans held by Venezuela, which, they got captured invading Venezuela. It seems kind of hard to, assert that the, executive just has a right to go into Venezuela and knock that country over to rescue two Americans who foolishly tried to invade it. And again, with Venezuela asking for the extradition, do you any idea how this plays out, or have you read anything that makes you think, we should expect this or at least look in this certain direction?
Well, yeah, I do think that they're going to deny the extradition request. I don't believe that they're going to hand over Goudreau anytime soon. However, I think it does set up a worrying thing because now we're in a position where the Venezuelan government does have two Americans in captivity. Now, the U.S. government might sort of be realizing its position here that it can't demand too hard because of what these guys were caught doing. You can't, take part in this crazy coup plot and then just get off scot-free, I guess. I mean, I would think that would be the approach. But we do nonetheless have a situation where there are two Americans captured in Venezuela. And I could easily see Pompeo and the State Department using that as a reason to further ratchet up hostilities with Venezuela, because they have these two Americans. That's certainly been something when Iran captures an American, that's something that we've used as leverage to ratchet up attention with that country. And so I could easily see that happening with Venezuela. Especially if, because these guys have been indicted there for conspiracy and terrorism for some very serious offenses. And depending on what their sentencing is, if they get some very draconian and harsh punishment for this, the State Department might decide that, hey, we need to go liberate these guys or something. So that could really create a real sticking point between our two countries.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is just, I think, a good reminder of the importance of diplomacy. If you remember back when Obama was negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, there was that raft, little dinghy of American, I think, Navy sailors that drifted over into Iranian waters, and they were picked up. And the Obama administration was able to pretty easily secure the release. Now, I know that's a different story where these guys were invading. And so I'm sure the Maduro administration will feel some need to at least hold some kind of public court and sentencing of these two American men, because they did try to overthrow the government. I think if you're a government, it's very hard to look at that situation and not assess that the correct move is to, assert that you cannot come onto my shores, try to overthrow me, and I will just send you back home at the end of the day. I don't think Maduro's going to calculate that. So I don't know what else do you have to add here, Will?
Yeah, there's just so many like little nooks and crannies and details of this story, but I think we pretty much covered all the broadest strokes. There's all kinds of like interesting stuff to go into with like, this Cliver Alcala guy. Like you had kind of raised this earlier. Like I'm also kind of curious how his indictment plays into this, because he did turn himself into the DEA and he did offer to cooperate with the prosecution. And so I kind of wonder like how he might have played into this whole story after his, turning himself in. Like he might have still played some role, in U.S. custody. So I think that's might be an interesting thing to talk about next time or something.
Great. So let's move on to talking about Mike Flynn. Now, I think me and you both wish when we're talking about Michael Flynn and justice, we're not talking about this Russiagate thing, which was phony charges against him, but rather the, war crimes that he committed in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, the deep state really targeted him early in the Russiagate conspiracy theory. And because me and you have been so dedicated to debunking the Russiagate conspiracy theory and, trying to help Americans understand that, the Russian government isn't the, enemy of the American people, and that they're not trying to undermine our elections. And this is just some, crap that the Democratic Party pulled and threw together after Hillary Clinton lost the election. And in doing so, you'll end up having to, unfortunately, defend idiots like Michael Flynn, really war criminals more so than idiots. But I guess when we get into this story, he is foolish. I can't believe he talked to the FBI. Right. So anyways, tell us why Mike Flynn was such a fool for talking to the FBI. And I know you don't have to go over the whole story because we have talked about Flynn on this show a lot. Anybody who wants to know, just Google FPF and Mike Flynn, and there's a long list of episodes now.
Yeah. So like clearly Flynn, his mistake talking to the FBI, we clearly saw like that was a mistake last week when these documents were unsealed, showing how the FBI was clearly trying to they admit their primary goal in investigating Flynn was to get him to lie so that they could prosecute or get him fired, basically admitting to setting a perjury trap for him. Where they, deliberately lure you into giving some kind of inconsistent testimony just so they can charge you. And so that's very clearly what they did to Flynn here. And so why he would have agreed to an FBI interview without counsel, without any legal attorney present, that does kind of, I think, make him a fool. But nonetheless, they did accomplish their end and get him charged for, quote unquote, lying to the FBI. However, last Thursday, after like 2.5 years on this case, the Department of Justice suddenly dropped their case against Michael Flynn. They dropped the charges. And this is one of the major cases that came out of the Mueller probe. They had accused him of lying to the FBI about a conversation he had had with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Sergei Kislyak. But now they've abandoned this whole case. The DOJ had said that there was actually no legitimate basis for the investigation into Flynn in the first place. And they said the prosecution hadn't actually proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Flynn even lied to the FBI in the first place either. So like all the stuff he was accused of, they're saying was never proven, and that there was no basis for the probe into him anyway. And these documents that came out showing the FBI admitting to its motive of, trying to catch him in a perjury trap, they were for some reason withheld from Flynn's defense team for years, but finally unsealed under a DOJ review. And these documents also showed that the FBI was getting ready to scrap its whole investigation into Flynn because they said that they couldn't find any derogatory information about him. And they said they had no legitimate basis to keep investigating. But the documents show that this one high-ranking agent, Peter Strzok, who's like factored into the story previously in other leaked messages and stuff, who was later fired and removed from the investigation for showing extreme bias in his, political bias. This Peter Strzok guy, though, he managed to convince the guys in charge of the Flynn probe to keep it going. And ultimately, they do this ambush interview where Flynn has no attorney, and Strzok and this other agent do exactly what they set out to do, and they get Flynn to perjure himself. And so that's the case that they just dropped against him. Now, Flynn had been trying to get the DOJ to drop these charges for quite a while, even before these latest documents came out. His first defense team had completely mishandled his case. They had also like illegitimately or suspiciously withheld important documents. They also turned down immunity deals that were offered to Flynn without even telling him about them. They did all kinds of shady things. And the government, too, at one point, they claimed they had lost a bunch of defense documents. So Flynn had cited all of this stuff, all of these shady dealings of the government and his first defense team in trying to get them to withdraw his guilty plea and trying to throw away his whole case. And so they had been reviewing that since January, his request. But these new documents apparently have tipped the scales that, showing this perjury trap plot. And of course, now, like in reaction to this, all the usual suspects are coming out and denouncing Bill Barr, the Attorney General, and the whole Department of Justice. There's been people like, if you go on Twitter, you can see like James Comey and Andrew McCabe, who are both heavily involved in the whole Russiagate probe. They are like slamming this decision. Jerry Nadler, the Democrat House Judiciary Chairman, he's already talking about launching a new investigation and calling Barr to testify about dropping the charges. So this, I guess we're going to get another like more endless investigations into Trump and this whole thing. Like one investigation just begets the other, I guess. But I would say this is a pretty serious blow to the whole Russiagate story. Not that the Democrats or the people on that side will ever admit it. They're just going to keep pressing on this forever, I guess. But, Flynn's indictment was like one of the major things that people pointed to in this whole Russiagate case. It was one of the only indictments that had anything to do with Russia whatsoever, like unlike, Paul Manafort and a few of these other guys. And even then, Flynn's case had no real relevance to all the nonsense about hacking and collusion to win the 2016 election. It was still not connected to that. But the DOJ, too, has already scrapped its other huge indictment, or one of its other huge indictments against the Russian troll farm, the Internet Research Agency, or its parent company. So, like, this thing has really fallen apart, I would say, like this whole Russiagate narrative. And last week, there were actually two big blows to the whole story. In addition to Flynn, on the same day, you also had the House Intelligence Committee drop this bunch of transcripts related to its Trump-Russia probe. And there's like thousands of documents in that thing. But like you have people have already found James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, which oversees the entire intelligence community, telling the House Intel Committee, Clapper did, that he had seen no direct empirical evidence of collusion with Russia in the Trump campaign. And so he would definitely be in a position to know.
And these documents are from 2017, correct? I think December 2017.
Yeah, I believe they're from.
And so. Wait, so 2 years before we get done with this whole impeachment nonsense, the Clapper and all these people are up there admitting that there's no evidence.
Yeah, exactly. And like,
so I don't know. I mean, has somebody gone around and collected clips? Because everybody on the House Intelligence Committee, including Adam Schiff, right, is on that committee, would have to have had heard that. And then went around telling people that they felt like Russiagate was true and that Michael Flynn was guilty of a whole bunch of long after 2017.
Yes. For years after. Yeah, after hearing Clapper, the top intelligence guy, saying that he has no evidence. And it wasn't just Clapper. It was also, all these people told the Intel Committee, Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice, Loretta Lynch, Samantha Power, all of these different senior officials in the Obama administration testified to the House Intelligence Committee that they had seen no direct evidence of collusion. Like, you can find all these quotes. They're all just giving these wishy-washy answers about, well, I've heard some people say that they, they're just dodging the answer. But ultimately, the question, they all answered it in the negative, that no, they had seen no good evidence for collusion. And this is all, I'm not sure exactly when all of these interviews took place. But definitely like years before, like now, it's years ago that they had admitted to this, and they still continued the story for all that time. And so yet again, I think, the skeptics of this story, I think, have sort of been vindicated. We've covered so many other examples of how this has happened. Like, we could go through the archives and come up with probably 24 shows we've done just purely going through these lies and deceit and deception, all kinds of ridiculous claims. And the Michael Flynn indictments and the transcripts that we got from the House Intelligence Committee, I guess those are just more to add to our giant pile that we have already.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like everybody at this point should be overwhelmed with information that Russiagate isn't true. It seems like if I went to and asked somebody who I thought believe that Russia had the election, and I asked them for evidence, they would have to struggle to find anything that me or you couldn't debunk in a matter of seconds. And even citing back, the exact articles and headlines where it was debunked like that. So I don't know. Do you see this having any impact on the actual debate? I guess, or any other thoughts on this? But it seems like, the Flynn dropping, of course, they spun that to be like, oh, it's the Trump Justice Department and everything. But dropping those charges and just, looking at the details of the case and where we're at on that now. And then again, this testimony coming out showing a whole bunch of Obama administration officials. So it can't be that, just they're controlled by the orange guy. And they're saying that, no, that this is bunk. We don't have any actual intelligence. It seems like it should be, poking some pretty large holes in. And I know Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes and Joy Reid could blow in a lot of hot air, but I don't know. It seems like that balloon should be deflating pretty quick for people.
Yeah, man. I don't know. Some of these Democratic critics or people who have been really pushing the Russiagate model or Russiagate story narrative. I don't think they'll ever admit that they were wrong about this. I think we've already seen, Jerry Nadler. He's already calling for a new investigation. It sounds like they're just going to parlay this into it's another scandal of the Trump Justice Department, like you said, kind of they're just going to turn it into another thing to attack him over and to, endlessly investigate about. And who knows, maybe it'll end up with some ridiculous indictment that we then have to I don't know, it's just going to continue the story for another year or something. I don't know. They're experts at parlaying this narrative and keeping it going, no matter how many times it gets shot down. I mean, they were able to somehow deflect all the Russiagate stuff into the Ukrainegate narrative. Their transition between that was perfect. And so who knows how they're going to, transition back out of this one. But I cannot see them admitting that, they were wrong about any of this anytime soon.
You maybe want to give them a little bit of credit for I don't want to say creativity because the lies are really bad. I think that if I really wanted to, I could come up with a better narrative for these people. But anyways, I don't know. I just can't imagine that eventually it's going to be too much and overwhelmed. But yeah, they're just persistence in this lie is absolutely incredible. And I guess maybe we'll be rounding show 600 will and still talking about and debunking some of these Russiagate narratives here in the next 6 months or so. And who knows what's going to happen. Trump wins re-election, but I definitely do want to stay on top of this as much as I am in part tired of talking about it at this point. I mean, I feel like we're so far removed from the whole Russiagate conspiracy that this had anything to do with Trump and Putin, just from the fact that the, call that this was all about, that they even were able to talk to him about his call with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, had absolutely nothing to do with colluding with Putin whatsoever. It was more, if anything, colluding with the Israelis, trying to push the Russians to adopt a more pro-Israeli agenda, not American agenda or anything. In the Trump foreign policy over these, past 3 years that we've already got to see has been incredibly hawkish on Russia. There's no way this guy is a puppet of Vladimir Putin. That's, the most absurd claim you could possibly make looking at how Trump has, operated his foreign policy. I think it's a lot easier to make the claim that Obama was a fool of Vladimir Putin than Donald Trump is, just looking at how the two of them have acted. And, Obama signed nuclear accords and didn't go to war with Russia over Ukraine, or, made that deal with the OPCW in Russia and Syria. I don't know. It's just all incredible. But, I know we are going a little bit long here, Will, but I would like to ask you about this important troop movement announcement that we have going on in Saudi Arabia. I'm seeing reports here that the U.S. is going to be moving out some Patriot missile batteries and maybe some fighter planes from Saudi Arabia. So this sounds like maybe a little bit of good news. Tell us the details.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, the last week, the U.S. announced that it would be removing these 2 Patriot missile batteries and I think a couple hundred soldiers who are stationed to maintain and operate them. I'm not totally. I think I'd seen 300 mentioned, but that seems a little high. But for how many needed there. But nonetheless, they're apparently pulling these guys out of Saudi Arabia, where they've been guarding these oil facilities there. These batteries were deployed there in one of the they were sent there in one of the deployments that followed the Houthi attacks on Saudi oil facilities and those other attacks on oil tankers last summer. It was in one of those retaliatory deployments that we had sent these Patriot batteries in particular. And they're also, they say they're pulling out 2 fighter jet squadrons. And I don't think they actually announced what kind of aircraft. They just said 2 squadrons. So we don't have like full details on that yet. But and they're apparently also considering removing other weapons and vehicles and stuff too. That and even drawing down some of the Navy presence in the Persian Gulf, I had read. So more drawdown could follow this initial pulling out of these Patriot missiles. It's not totally clear though why they're doing this. I've seen a few different rationales for it. So you had the Pentagon saying that it was just a routine thing and that they rotate out these Patriot batteries for maintenance and repair, and it's just like a regular thing. But I think there's good reason to believe there's more going on here. There's a couple other reasons why this may have happened. A lot of people have been speculating that this is linked to a U.S. dispute with the Saudis over oil production. So you had earlier this year, the Saudis had ramped up their oil output. They got into this sort of price war with the Russians, and it sent prices crashing down. They had boosted up their production a lot. And so because of that, and because of the falling demand that's related to the pandemic right now, because all air travel's down and there's a lot of demand down for oil in general, oil prices have hit rock bottom. And this has taken a particularly heavy toll on the U.S. shale oil industry. And at one point, people might remember this was a big headline. U.S. crude futures for crude oil sank into the negative numbers. And so it was a kind of an unheard of thing that is happening, that prices are that low. And so back in early April, Trump did, on a phone call with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, he actually did threaten to pull out U.S. military support from Saudi Arabia if it didn't scale back oil production. But that was before, though, the oil producing countries, they call it OPEC plus. It's like a OPEC and a couple other countries. That was before they had agreed to drastically slash oil output. And so that threat actually back in April might have actually been what convinced the Saudis to go along with that production cut. But I don't know, they apparently already agreed on it, though. So maybe Trump wants them to cut it even more. And that's why he's doing this troop withdrawal. I'm not totally sure. Or this missile withdrawal. It's not totally clear. But we do have it on record that Trump threatened Saudi Arabia to do this previously over the oil thing. However, though, according to the Wall Street Journal, they gave a totally different reason for why this is happening. They said that this drawdown is happening because senior defense officials have concluded that Iran, quote, no longer poses an immediate threat to American interests in the region, in the Persian Gulf there. And so if that's the case, I think that's a much bigger deal than doing this for leverage over oil. I think that would mean they're shifting their overall assessment of Iran, it would seem of Iran, pulling out these Patriot batteries. We've had this massive buildup in and around the region, in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East over the last year or so. We've had quite a bit of hostile, exchanges with the Iranians. We assassinated their major general, Qasem Soleimani, all kinds of stuff. And if the Wall Street Journal is correct, though, they could be deciding that Iran doesn't pose as big of a threat as we decided. And so now as we thought before. And so now they're, withdrawing. So I don't know. I'm not totally sure what explains this. There's a couple different possible reasons. And of course, we still have all kinds of layers of sanctions on Iran. And so even if the military is deciding now that Iran is posing a less of a threat for whatever reason, the White House doesn't really seem to be following that lead. They've shown no signs of scaling back their economic war on Iran. And so I don't know. I think this is an interesting development, but there's still some mysteries as to exactly why it happened.
Yeah, so I guess we could hope that it's a real assessment and change in the Trump administration. My fear is, unfortunately, we're going to see the pattern that we've so often been disappointed by in the Trump administration, where you have something that looks good, like announcing a troop withdrawal. You have some people within the Trump administration or some reports, in the Wall Street Journal at times, sounding alarmist in our eyes. It's a good thing, saying that, Trump is really serious about pulling U.S. troops out of, Syria or something like that. And then the Hots jump on it and they're all like, oh, no, we can't do that because of this and that. And, oh, there's oil here. And, Jack Keane and Lindsey Graham have maps and they're real good at convincing Trump. So many of these things have just so quickly kind of fizzled and faded away. Not because at the time I don't think Trump legitimately meant that he, I think he really wants, to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. I think there was a time where he wanted to get U.S. troops out of Somalia and Syria. but they so easily convinced otherwise. Just time and time again means that U.S. troops end up staying and he sides with the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it like plenty of times, like you've said, like with the announced withdrawal from Syria. Like, Trump couldn't have really been clearer about that when he said we're getting out of Syria. And then over the next week after that followed, we had all these think pieces coming out in mainstream media outlets where they're citing, the Institute for the Study of War, all these neocon think tanks and stuff, saying why we absolutely can't do that, why, it would just be a nightmare if we pulled out of Syria. And so I expect, if this is part of some, pullout or broader scale back in the Middle East, if we're changing our assessment of Iran, I would expect the very same players to start coming out and screaming bloody murder about it, saying how we can't do this and how I actually think I saw the New York Times, like the way they were writing about it was like, he's cutting against this like 70-year alliance with the Saudis and like saying it like it's a bad thing. So we could definitely expect that kind of reaction if it is indeed part of it's not just some routine, maintenance thing. If this has to do with like a larger reassessment, then yeah, we're definitely about to see a major backlash.
Well, it's just another reminder of why I'm a libertarian, because the state, just assumes more and more power. It expands more and more. Then anytime you talk about scaling it back, even, we're just talking about here moving back and bringing back some Patriot missiles that were deployed to Iran in January. It's like you're forfeiting the entire empire anytime you look to take a scalpel and, lop off a little boil like this one. So, it's always an uphill battle. I saw today that Donald Trump said he had a call with the Saudi king and reaffirmed the defense pact. So my guess is that long term, nothing's, changing here. Donald Trump continues to, I believe, want to maintain the relationship with Saudi Arabia as it is. I'm sure he would like them to lower oil production, but it is what it is, and we're going to stay. That said, it could be a good thing that we bring a few troops home, and maybe Donald Trump is motivated in part by coronavirus and not wanting American troops to get sick overseas or whatever it is. But hopefully we see at least a few U.S. troops coming home here.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up. I know it's been a little bit on the longer side, but I really appreciate everybody for tuning into the show. Make sure you go and share the show over at the Libertarian Institute. And then you find Will Porter at RT. He writes there every day, but his names aren't on the articles. But you can find the ones that he writes either by following his Facebook page, Will Porter. It's not a common name, but he's the guy with, like, I believe you have like an anarchist symbol, right, on your Facebook picture.
I think it's just me standing there.
Oh, okay. All right, never mind. And so look for the guy with the mustache.
There you go. Yeah.
And then Twitter at WKP&Cap, and he'll tweet out or post his articles usually, I guess, when you're done with your shift, like early in the morning. So every morning you'll have some good reading, what's going on around the world, covering a lot of important stuff. And Will, thanks for coming back to the show.
Glad to be back, Kyle. Thank you.